Eastern Ontario exhibits a rich architectural history, with influences from a variety of peoples and centuries. Buildings in Ontario have to withstand cold winters and warm summers, and a variety of styles have influenced the buildings that can be seen in Ontario today. Studying architectural history reveals the climate of the area, as well as the unique economic and social conditions that people experienced. Prior to European contact, Indigenous peoples lived in what is now the province of Ontario for centuries. Their building styles evolved with time, and at the time Europeans came to the Great Lakes region, many of the Iroquois-speaking peoples lived in longhouses. Since actual longhouses do not remain from pre-contact times, archaeologists and historians rely on the decayed remains of longhouses, oral histories, and written accounts by Europeans to get a picture of what these structures looked like. Longhouses ranged greatly in size. Some accounts record 6 to 8 meters in length, while archaeological digs have revealed longhouses 93 meters long. These buildings had straight sides with rounded ends and were made out of wood. A village was made up of multiple longhouses, and families would live together in the buildings. Wigwams are another type of dwelling that Algonquin, Ojibwe, and other indigenous peoples used. They are often conical in shape and made from wood, and sometimes the outside is covered with animal hides. Since wigwams were used throughout eastern North America, there are many different types. These shelters could be transported, so people could move from one place to another as the seasons changed. Until the American War for Independence, the majority of the population in what is now Ontario were Indigenous peoples. Europeans had visited the Great Lakes region, and various missionaries had also lived in this area, but there were no large European settlements. With the American War for Independence, which ended in 1783, thousands of Loyalists fled to the British colonies in Canada. Some of these Loyalists settled in what is now Ontario, and in 1791, Lower Canada, which is now Quebec, and Upper Canada, now Ontario, were created. The Ottawa River divided the two provinces. At first, buildings were erected simply because people needed places to live and store supplies. Over time, Europeans became more comfortable and settled in Upper Canada, so buildings began to exhibit more style. When Europeans first began to build in Upper Canada, their buildings were similar in style to those of the Atlantic provinces. Nevertheless, Georgian classicism soon became the dominant style seen in the structures of European settlers to Upper Canada. Georgian architecture is named after the four King Georges who reigned England from 1714 to 1830. During this time period and onward into the 1800s, Georgian architectural style was popular in Upper Canada. The buildings constructed in Canada tended to mirror the structures in England or the United States. In England, Neo-Palladianism was common till the 1760s. This style was characterized by its attempt to recreate the architectural style of ancient Rome, and it influenced Georgian architecture. Baroque architecture had been popular in England previously, but after the Glorious Revolution, England tried to distance itself from the Baroque style. This led to less decorated yet still attractive buildings and a formalized system of proportions. For English loyalists in Upper Canada, the Georgian style represented patriotism to the crown, so it was quickly integrated into the colonists' buildings. Furthermore, Georgian style could be incorporated into the grand buildings of the wealthy as well as the more humble homes of the poor, making it versatile. Architecture was also used to demonstrate wealth, sophistication, and even values regarding social practices and politics. The Field House, situated near Niagara-on-the-Lake, captures the values of Georgian architecture. The structure is block-like and symmetrical, with a simple door and large, undecorated chimneys. The front porch demonstrates more neoclassical than Georgian style, with its decorative pillars and pedimented roof. Within the Georgian architecture period in Ontario were periods of Neoclassical, Greek Revival, Regency, and Gothic Revival styles. The Neoclassical style emulated the Roman classical style, similar to Neo-Palladian style, but it was less rigid in its design. Homes built with this style appeared more refined and light-hearted than the basic Georgian-style homes. This style was popular in France, England, and the United States, but also in Canada, where it is sometimes known as Loyalist style. With the War of 1812, many Georgian-style buildings in the major cities were destroyed, and when the cities were rebuilt, they were replaced with buildings that embodied the neoclassical style. Greek Revival architecture is very similar to neoclassical, but is based on ancient Greek rather than ancient Roman architecture. In Ontario, Greek Revival-style buildings were inspired by those buildings with this style in England and the United States. The Americans associate with the Greek struggle for independence, increasing the popularity of this style in the United States. Willowbank, a house in Queenston, captures the Greek Revival style in Ontario. The monumental cubic form, slightly sloping roof, and white columns are typical of Greek Revival houses. The grandeur of the entire building is brought out through its use of Greek Revival style. Regency-style architecture was popular from about 1815 to 1860 and was named after George IV, who was the Prince Regent. However, the Regency style found its roots earlier in the 1700s with the Romantic movement. Romantics are characterized by their embracing of emotion and individualism, as well as their love of nature. These values appeared in Regency-style architecture. A building was to be part of the landscape, but also dramatic. Dundurn Castle in Hamilton, built in 1835, artfully displays Regency architecture as well as neoclassical and Greek Revival styles. The setting chosen for the building, near Burlington Bay, demonstrate Regency style's value of an important place in the landscape. In the 1850s, the prominent Greek Revival portico was added. The Romantic movement pulled architectural inspiration from many places, but Gothic style became one of the most popular styles for the Romantics. Gothic Revival began in England in the mid-1700s and in Ontario was popular from the 1830s till the 1890s. Gothic Revival can often be found in the decorative aspects of Georgian homes because the medieval flair was easy to add to structures. The most obvious use of Gothic Revival in Ontario is Canada's Parliament buildings, which were completed in 1866. The designs submitted for the Parliament buildings tended towards neoclassical or Gothic Revival styles. Gothic Revival had been used in the English Parliament buildings, and it was seen to represent parliamentary democracy, so it was chosen. In contrast to the Georgian architecture of much of the previous century, Italianate-style buildings were heavily decorated and lively. Italianate style allowed for creativity through its lack of rigid proportions or prominent style identifiers. Ornamentation was the defining feature of this style. This home in Napanee has Italianate style in its long windows and bracketed cornice, which is the white trim along the edge of the roof. When Italianate style homes were built, they were often designed to have verandas, like this one, but then the verandas were sometimes too expensive to be built. Most owners still built the second floor door, even though the veranda could not be afforded. These upper-level doors with no balcony were nicknamed suicide doors, and you could see them in old buildings across Ontario. From 1865 to 1880, Second Empire was another popular architectural style. This style came out of the early years of the reign of Napoleon III, when this emperor had grand structures built in Paris. Inspired by French history, including the French Renaissance and the First French Empire, this style had an element of sophisticated modernity. From France, the style spread to England and then the United States, where it became very popular. In turn, the style spread from the United States to Canada, where it was not embraced with quite the same enthusiasm as in the United States. This house, in St. Mary's, was built in 1881 and captures the major characteristics of Second Empire architecture. Its mansard roof holds a place of prominence above the rest of the house, which is an important aspect of this style. The Romanesque Revival was a style defined by rounded arches, plain stonework, groups of columns, and vaulted dome ceilings. The revival started in Germany, and from there it spread to other countries. In Ontario, there was the first Romanesque Revival, which was popular in the mid-1800s, as well as the Richardsonian Romanesque, which was popular from about 1880 to 1900. Queen Anne style, which is sometimes also considered a revival, was popular in Ontario from 1890 to 1914. This style was inspired by a range of periods and architectural styles. It encouraged the return to the cozy and somewhat romanticized home. Designed by Canadian architect George Martel Miller, the Ryan House in Guelph captures some of the attributes of Queen Anne architecture. The brick walls and decorative stone around the doorway and window are Romanesque, while chateau style, a type of French architecture, can also be seen in aspects of the building. This building also leans toward the more grand influences on Queen Anne style, rather than the more domestic and homey feel some Queen Anne style buildings display. The arts and crafts movement began in the mid to late 1800s and in some ways agreed with the Romantic ideas that machinery and industrialization was bad, and this movement had an interest in the medieval as well. The movement brought about a new appreciation of the decorative arts and slowly found its way into Canadian architecture. The style of architecture born out of this movement has many names, but it tends to look medieval. In some ways, the arts and crafts movement is a bit of a contradiction, as the architecture attempted to be free of style, yet to be an English style with an aura of medieval. For this reason, arts and craft movement homes in Ontario can look very different. Eden Smith, a Canadian architect, is remembered for his influence on the Canadian arts and crafts movement architecture. He was commissioned to build an affordable housing complex in Toronto, which was completed in 1914. Riverdale Courts, the resulting complex, demonstrates the ideals of the arts and crafts movement with its irregular roofs, brick and stucco outside walls, and lack of institutional feel. With the 1900s came a renewed interest in the classical, leading to the rise of Edwardian classicism in Ontario. The Snyder Seagram house in Waterloo is an excellent example of this style. The pillared, covered front porch was typical of Edwardian classicism, as were the diamond-paned glass windows. Around the turn of the century, with the death of Queen Victoria, there were many architectural revivals as people wanted to create new and creative buildings. There was the Colonial Revival, Egyptian Revival, Tudor Revival, Dutch Colonial Revival, and many more. Architecture continues to evolve and grow, taking inspiration, as it always has, from a variety of different places and movements. During the 1900s, there was a movement away from the history-inspired architecture towards using new structural systems, materials, and decorations. However, buildings continued to hold some aspects of older architecture, as a home is still a home, meant to provide a place to live, sleep, eat, and spend time together. Architecture in Eastern Ontario has changed a lot in the last 4 centuries, from the longhouses of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and other Indigenous peoples, to the cubes and boxes of Georgian architecture, to the more artsy Italianate and arts and craft movement styles. When thinking about Canadian identity, architecture is probably not the first thing that comes to mind, but architecture is nevertheless ingrained in Canadian society in a unique way. Architecture connects people to the land in Canada. Some styles very obviously highlight the importance of the landscape, like Regency or the arts and craft movement styles. But the importance of the landscape is present in all styles of Canadian architecture. Canadian architecture critic Lisa Rochon even stated that Canadians are defined by the land. Our architecture is landscape. In Canadian architecture, one can also see Canada's rich history and diverse background. Architectural inspirations came from around the world, although inspiration often seems to be drawn from Europe and the United States. Canadian architects would take a style and add their own flair to make it Canadian. Today, with increased globalization and a growing population in urban areas, architects continue to get creative as they build structures in hundreds of different styles and populate the skyline.